Nahum, a prophet often forgotten, was the messenger of one of the Bible's most thunderous declarations, the fall of Nineveh, the proud capital of the dreaded Assyrian Empire. In an age marked by oppression, cruelty, and terror, Nahum received a divine mission to proclaim the inevitable judgment against one of history's most powerful empires. While others trembled at Assyria's seemingly indestructible might, he stood firm, declaring, God's justice was coming. His life stands as a testament to courage, faith, and a timeless warning. No kingdom, however mighty, escapes the hand of the Almighty. Nahum was born in Elkosh, a small, obscure village nestled among quiet hills and humble landscapes. From childhood, he heard blood-chilling tales of Assyrian terror, armies razing cities, families dragged into slavery, merciless plunder. The brutality knew no limits, and Israel groaned under its unbearable weight. With each new attack, the same questions haunted the people. Where is the God of our ancestors? Why does he allow such evil? Will Assyria's power go unpunished? Young Nahum watched the weary faces of his neighbors, etched with fear and despair. He grew up in that anguish, yet with a quiet, unshakable conviction. God would not ignore such injustice forever. Over time, he became a reserved man, deeply reflective, pondering God's role in the face of evil. Unbeknownst to him, he was being shaped for a mission far greater than he could imagine, as if an invisible yet overwhelming shadow began to settle over him. Then came the visions. They arrived like vivid dreams. Nineveh's walls collapsing, crowds fleeing, the city swallowed by chaos. Awakening, he wrestled with questions. Why was God showing him this? Why him? What could the Lord expect from a simple man of Elkosh? But there was no escape. When God speaks, silence is not an option. For days he withdrew, straining to understand the visions. At first he tried to ignore them. How could he, a nobody from a nowhere village, deliver such a colossal prophecy? Announcing the fall of Nineveh, the most powerful city of its time, seemed like madness. Everyone feared the Assyrians. Their walls were colossal, their treasures endless, and their army appeared invincible. Who would be foolish enough to believe such an empire was destined to crumble? Yet, no matter how hard he tried to push the visions away, they returned, stronger each time. Nahum saw fire engulfing the city. He heard the screams of its people. He felt an inescapable divine presence wrapping around him. This was no ordinary dream. It was God revealing the future. But with this revelation came an unbearable weight. He walked the streets of Elkosh, watching his people, wondering how to begin. How could he tell them God's justice was about to descend upon Nineveh? Fear crept in. He knew his message wouldn't be welcomed. They might mock him, call him a madman, or worse. Yet the clearer the visions grew, the more he understood. He had no choice. He wasn't just a bystander. He had been chosen to speak. And so, in the quiet of dawn, Nahum accepted the call. But accepting the call was only the beginning. What followed was an inner battle. He spent nights in prayer, begging for strength to fulfill such a daunting mission. God wasn't asking him to bring comfort or hope. Those would have been easy. No, he was to proclaim destruction to a city that seemed untouchable. Many would see him as a troublemaker, a lunatic, an enemy. The weight of that burden pressed on him daily. Sometimes he doubted. He wandered the fields around Elkosh, searching for peace, but the visions never left. Each scene grew more vivid than the last. He could hear the thunder of collapsing walls, see flames devouring the city, and then, absolute silence. This wasn't a nightmare. It was a message, and Nahum knew he could not stay silent. The visions were so intense that at times, he could taste the smoke in his lungs, as if he were already walking through Nineveh's smoldering ruins. Then, during one of his solitary walks, he stopped. He looked up at the sky and cried out for an answer. What should I do? No audible voice replied. But in his heart, a deep certainty ignited. No matter how hard it was, he had to speak. God had chosen him. And neither fear nor doubt could stop him now. And so, his preparation began. He knew the message would meet resistance. Few would believe that such a mighty empire could fall. But Nahum carried an unshakable conviction. God's justice was real, and its truth burned in his visions. Now he only needed to wait for the right moment. Then it struck him, the time for silence was over. What raged inside him could no longer be contained. With unwavering resolve, he walked the streets of Elkosh. At first, few listened. Some passed by without a glance. Others paused out of sheer curiosity. Who was this man daring to speak against Nineveh, the heart of an unconquerable empire? But Nahum never faltered. His voice rang out, strong, clear, and unafraid. He proclaimed God's wrath against violence, oppression, and arrogance. He declared that Nineveh would be destroyed, its walls shattered, its treasures plundered, its people unable to escape divine judgment. Many stared in disbelief. How could anyone predict the fall of such an unshakable power? Nineveh was the crown of the known world, a symbol of wealth, military might, and dominion. The idea of its ruin seemed ludicrous. Yet something in Nahum's words began to stir hope, especially among those who had suffered under Assyria's yoke. In their hearts, the seed of justice took root. What if it were true? What if God was finally moving against the city that had brought them so much pain? Even the skeptics started listening. Not everyone believed, of course. Many still insisted Nineveh's walls were unbreakable, its army unbeatable. How could one man, powerless and alone, claim otherwise? But Nahum pressed on. He wasn't relying on human arguments. His strength came from something far greater. Of one thing he was certain: God had spoken, and he wouldn't stop until the world heard. Every word he uttered seemed to charge the air with an invisible force. Nahum sensed it. The hour of divine justice was nearing, and what came next would be even harder to accept. As his message spread beyond Elkosh, reactions grew fiercer. Some began to worry. Whispers of Nineveh's impending fall soon reached the ears of regional leaders. Alarm spread. They feared Nahum was stirring a rebellion. Some dismissed him as just another fanatic, a man who would eventually tire or fade into obscurity. But Nahum did not speak for himself. A growing discontent simmered across the nations. Assyria's oppression had left deep wounds, and the idea that Nineveh would finally face judgment began to stir long-buried hope in broken hearts. The conquered, the exiled, those crushed under the boot of a merciless empire. In Nahum's words, they heard the echo of justice they'd waited for. With each passing day, Nahum spoke louder. He proclaimed that God would not let the violent go unpunished. And though Judah still trembled in fear, his words kindled a flicker of hope. But not everyone responded with faith. Some leaders felt threatened. They feared his preaching would provoke Assyria's wrath. They accused him of stirring chaos, confronted him, pressured him, tried to discredit him. Yet he would not stop. Something greater than himself drove him forward. Even when his life was at risk, Nahum never hesitated. The message he carried wasn't his own, and he knew it. Then rumors began to spread. Whispers of cracks in the Assyrian Empire, rebellions in distant lands, a power no longer as unshakable as it seemed. Nahum watched as his visions inched toward reality. His message unsettled the powerful even more. News of his prophecies reached Assyria's ears. They feared his words would ignite rebellion. Spies were sent to track him. Plots were hatched to silence him for good. Nahum knew the danger was real, but he also knew there was no turning back. The truth had to be spoken no matter the cost. Yet, against all odds, Nahum kept escaping. Every time soldiers closed in, he stayed one step ahead, slipping through unseen paths, shielded by what seemed like an invisible hand. Meanwhile, behind Nineveh's mighty walls, decay had set in. Political intrigue, betrayals, corruption eating at the empire's core. Nahum didn't see this as chance. He knew God was moving. What he'd prophesied was closer than ever. Nahum watched with steady eyes and a quiet heart. Nineveh's once loyal allies now turned against the empire. The visions that had once terrified him made perfect sense now. He saw it clearly. Nineveh's fall was coming, like a river bursting its banks, unstoppable and devastating. Yet Nineveh clung to its arrogance. Its leaders refused to believe any revolt could shake them. Nothing could destroy their power. But Nahum knew the truth. Destruction would come from where they least expected. Not their walls. Not their armies. Not their wealth. Nothing could stop what God had decreed. Inside Nineveh's walls, the cracks spread. What once seemed unbreakable now showed its weakness. The rebellions Nahum had prophesied were no longer distant rumors. They were at the gates. The city that had ruled from the heights of power now trembled under the weight of crisis. The palace drowned in intrigue. Leaders turned on each other, clawing for control. The people who had once basked in Nineveh's shadow began to whisper, "Could the end be nearer than we thought?" Nahum's voice grew stronger. He preached of God's justice, a reckoning not just for individuals but for kingdoms. Nineveh, built on violence and terror, now faced its downfall, exactly as he had foretold. Even those who once ignored him now listened intently. News from within Nineveh grew darker. Corruption spread like a plague. The armies that had proudly defended the city were now crippled by infighting. Still, Nineveh refused to bend. Its rulers trusted in strategic alliances and golden promises, certain they could regain control. They sent envoys to neighboring nations making desperate bargains. But every plan failed. It was as if a divine shadow loomed over them, as if every scheme had been doomed from the start. Nahum understood now, this was the hand of God at work. In his visions, Nineveh's fall was no longer a possibility, but a certainty. What he didn't yet know was how swift and devastating that end would be. As the city crumbled from within, its leaders scrambled desperately to regain control. Secret meetings were held. Lands, gold, even political power were offered, anything to stave off collapse. But just as Nahum had proclaimed, nothing worked. The empire's heart was rotten. No earthly effort could save it. Meanwhile, the enemy armies mobilized. Nations that had suffered for decades under Assyria's yoke now saw their chance for vengeance. Babylon and Media, once rivals, joined forces, plotting the final siege. The impossible had become inevitable. Nineveh, the unconquerable city, was surrounded. The walls that had once been its pride now felt like a trap with no escape. From a distance, Nahum watched his visions unfold. He knew the siege was only the beginning, because the attackers wouldn't come just from outside. The Tigris River, which had flowed peacefully past Nineveh's walls for centuries, would rise as an instrument of divine judgment. Even nature itself would turn against the city. Nineveh's days of glory were numbered. Yet even as enemy forces closed in and the river's waters grew restless, its leaders clung to delusions of survival. But the siege had begun. Babylon and Media, united in purpose, encircled the city with cold determination. They would tear down the empire that had broken their people for generations. The walls that once struck fear into invaders now showed cracks, weakened by time and the weight of justice. Inside Nineveh, despair festered. Those who had trusted in their gods and the strength of their fortresses now choked on terror. Food dwindled. The streets echoed with wails of anguish. Nahum? He watched from afar with an unsettling calm. Not indifference, but the quiet certainty of a prophet who had seen it all before it happened. The visions that once seemed impossible were now reality. And then came the rain, torrents of water falling relentlessly, causing the Tigris River to swell beyond control. The raging waters battered Nineveh's foundations until a section of the wall collapsed, granting the enemy armies their opening. They surged in with fury, leaving devastation in their wake. The palace was looted, its treasures seized, and the leaders who didn't flee were executed. The city that believed itself invincible was brought to its knees, defeated not just by men, but by divine judgment. A tomb-like silence fell over the land. Nineveh, once the symbol of power and arrogance, was now a smoldering ruin. The invaders carried off gold and spoils as flames consumed what had been the heart of the Assyrian Empire. Nahum's prophecy had been fulfilled completely. The city that for centuries had spread terror through brutality and domination was utterly humiliated. The fire Nahum had seen in his visions now raged across the sky, pillars of smoke visible for miles. This wasn't just a military victory, it was the precise execution of God's justice. Every word Nahum had spoken, every vision he'd shared, unfolded with undeniable accuracy. In Judah, news of Nineveh's fall sparked awe and reverence. Those who'd once doubted the prophet now recognized the truth of his message. The impenetrable city had fallen in mere days. For those who'd suffered under Assyria's yoke, its collapse felt like waking from a long nightmare. This wasn't just the end of a city, it was the unraveling of an empire. Nahum's voice echoed across the known world. He was no longer just a prophet but living proof that God sees, hears, and acts. His once ignored message was now studied with fear. Even Babylon, the rising power after the sack, couldn't ignore the weight of his words. What happened to Nineveh could happen to any nation built on violence and oppression. Meanwhile, nations long oppressed by Assyria began to rise. Rebellions erupted, old treaties shattered, and the world order crumbled. The once unshakable empire was erased from history, just as Nahum had foretold. And in the quiet hills of El-Kosh, the prophet stood as a beacon of unwavering faith, a reminder that no power, however great, can outlast the judgment of God. The map of power was redrawn by hands that yearned for freedom. Nahum, knowing his mission was complete, withdrew in silence. He sought no glory, no rewards. His task had been to proclaim God's justice, and he'd done so faithfully. Now, as the world rebuilt itself atop Nineveh's ashes, he found peace. Though he faded from public view, his name echoed across nations. Kings and rulers spoke of him, a simple man with no army or crown who'd foretold the fall of an invincible empire. His words didn't fade with time. they became a dire warning to all who'd walked the path of oppression. For though God's justice may seem delayed, it never fails. Nahum understood his message wasn't just about Nineveh. It was an eternal warning. The city's fate stood as a stark example of what befalls any nation that abuses power, crushes the weak, and scorns justice. Every new kingdom, every rising empire, would need to remember the Assyrians' end. And so his words passed from generation to generation, preserved, studied, revered, not as a relic of ruin, but as a beacon lighting the path of righteousness. Nahum never sought personal glory. For him, only one thing mattered: God's will be done. With humility, he'd accepted his role as the messenger of a truth the world needed to hear. His story didn't end with Nineveh's fall. That was where his legacy began. Because Nineveh's collapse wasn't just an empire's demise, it was a lesson for all humanity. A reminder that no earthly power is eternal. That however high an empire rises, if built on arrogance and oppression, its doom is certain. The mighty may ignore justice for a time but never forever. Sooner or later, the weight of their deeds catches up. Nahum was the voice of that unrelenting justice. And his message, far from being confined to the past, still challenges every generation. It calls us to reflect on the cycles of power, pride, and downfall. It reminds us that true strength isn't found in armies or walls, but in justice, compassion, and faithfulness to God. In his humility, Nahum was chosen to speak a hard truth, one the world desperately needed to hear. And Nahum never hesitated to speak that truth, not even when the world called it impossible. This is why Nahum's story isn't just about a prophet. It's a masterclass in faith, courage, and trusting that God always acts at the perfect moment, even when injustice appears to rule the world. In Nahum's journey, we discover we're all called to pursue justice. No matter how invincible earthly powers may seem, nothing escapes God's sight. He watches, and when the time comes, he acts. He restores the balance our broken world desperately needs. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our next powerful biblical stories. Together, let's keep uncovering the Bible's timeless lessons of faith, love, and hope that still speak to our lives today.